What would you do if the biggest truth in your family was whispered to you in the last moments of someone's life? I was 14, the night my grandmother called me closer to her hospital bed, her hand trembling, her eyes strangely alert, like she'd been waiting decades just for this moment. I'm 77 years old now, but I can still hear her voice as clearly as the machine beeping behind her. She told me our family had a buried fortune, real money, hidden away from everyone. And then she told me something, even more unsettling. It was never meant to be found by the wrong hands. I remember the smell of antiseptic, the dim yellow light, the way the hallway went quiet, as if the building itself wanted to listen. She didn't say treasure like in children's stories. She said reparation, consequence, proof, words heavy enough to bend the air. She pressed a folded paper into my palm, part map, part confession, and made me promise to listen to my conscience before I ever followed it. That was the first time I understood that secrets have weight, that they do not disappear when the person dies. They move into the chest of the one who hears them. My grandmother had always been the soft one, the one who held the family together with gentle hands and knowing smiles. But in those last minutes I saw another side, fear, urgency, guilt. She spoke of the 1940s and 1950s in fragments, of money that was never ours, of men who never came back, of my grandfather's long nights and locked drawers. She didn't give me answers, only pieces, as if the truth itself was dangerous if spoken aloud. Outside, cars passed, life went on, while my life tilted quietly in that room. And then she said the sentence that has followed me for 6 decades. You will know when the ground calls you. I didn't understand it then. Maybe I still don't. But from that night on, every family reunion, every argument over nothing, every silence at the dinner table felt like it was circling around something. Buried, not just in the earth, but in us. I grew up carrying a map I never used and a promise I never broke, watching people I loved act like actors in a play whose script I'd seen only half of. The fortune is real, the place is real, and the cost of touching it is real too, in ways I learned slowly and painfully over the years. I've never dug a single inch of that soil, not because I couldn't, but because of what came with the knowledge of where it lies and why it was hidden. And that story begins with that quiet room, her fading voice, and the chill of knowing my childhood ended the moment she let go of my hand and closed her eyes forever, leaving the rest unsaid, on purpose, so the truth would unroll itself like a shadow over time, rather than strike like lightning in a single moment. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something directly. Stories like this are not just about money or mystery. They are about conscience, family, and the weight of secrets we are never supposed to carry. If any part of what I've shared so far made you think about your own family history, your own unanswered questions, or the things that were never said out loud, tell me in the comments. Your perspective matters more than you think, and reading what you share helps others realize they are not alone with their hidden chapters. If you're finding this story meaningful or intriguing, leave a like so more people can hear it. And if you want to follow the rest of this confession, because we're only at the beginning, make sure you subscribe. This is not just entertainment. It's about understanding how secrets shape lives across generations. From the outside, my family looked ordinary. Dinners on Sundays, photographs lined up on mantels, polite smiles at weddings and funerals. But once my grandmother died, I began to see the cracks, as if her absence turned the lights on in a dim room. Conversations stopped the moment I walked in. Arguments happened behind closed doors. Entire decades were referenced with a single sentence. We don't talk about that. I was a child growing into an adult, inside a house built on omissions, and only I knew there was a buried fortune beneath all that silence. It wasn't the money itself that haunted me. It was the way people behaved around the idea of it without even knowing it existed. My father and his brothers didn't trust each other. They counted favors like accountants, remembered old insults like historians. My mother cried quietly at night sometimes, not loud, never dramatic, just a slow leak of sadness she didn't explain. There were locked boxes in closets, letters burned in the sink, and relatives who suddenly stopped visiting for reasons no one would name. It felt as if everyone sensed a storm had passed long ago, and left the air charged forever. When I was older, I started noticing patterns. My grandfather's name was spoken carefully, as though it might break. One uncle drank too much and changed, the subject whenever the past was mentioned. Another moved far away and sent postcards instead of explanations. The family tree had branches that simply ended, cousins who went west, joined the army, or married and disappeared, like characters written out of a story. You don't need to be told there's a secret when the entire house behaves as if one is living in the walls. The most unsettling part was the smiles. Polite, controlled, too practiced. Holidays were performances. We wore our best clothes and our safest versions of the truth. I learned early how to speak without saying anything, and how to listen for what people weren't willing to say. The fortune underground became a symbol of everything else buried. Grudges, betrayals, unfinished conversations, and choices made in the dark that shaped us all in daylight. The adults pretended nothing was wrong, but the children learned the rules anyway. Don't ask, don't dig, don't remember too much. As the years went by, I realized the lie wasn't a single sentence someone told. It was a way of living. Our family avoided the past like a room with a locked door, and I was the only one holding the key, even if I didn't fully understand the lock. The map my grandmother had given me burned like a secret inside my pocket of memory, and every uneasy glance between relatives seemed to point toward it without knowing why. That was when I understood something frightening. A secret doesn't stay in the ground. It grows up through the people who stand above it. The map wasn't a pirate's treasure sketch with an X and palm trees. It was worse than that. It was subtle. It was designed to be understood only by someone who already knew too much. Over the years, I discovered that my grandmother hadn't left just one map. She had scattered pieces of it through our house, our photographs, even our habits. At 15, I thought the folded paper in my drawer was everything. At 25, I realized it was only a doorway. By 40, I understood she had hidden the truth the same way our family hid emotions, in plain sight but never named. The page she placed in my hand was covered with lines that weren't streets and numbers that weren't dates. A curve that looked like a river turned out to be the edge of an old stone wall on our property. The numbers matched distances only if you walked them, counting steps the way my grandfather used to when he paced the yard at night. She had written small symbols in the corners, a crescent, a star, a tiny square, that I later found again embroidered into the corner of her tablecloths, carved faintly into the back of picture frames, and once, unbelievably, inside the margin of a family Bible under a pressed leaf. It became impossible to ignore. Old photographs held people smiling stiffly in front of landmarks that no longer existed, a barn that mysteriously burned, a tree that had been cut down, a fence line that shifted after the war. A letter written in 1951 mentioned a picnic that clearly never happened. It was a direction, not a memory. Even songs my grandmother hummed while cooking had repeating phrases that matched the pattern of turns you would take if you started at the east gate and walked toward the hill at dusk. The past wasn't just remembered in my family, it was encoded, and yet every clue came with a feeling of being watched by time itself. When I traced those lines, my hands shook, not from greed, but from the sense that someone before me had done the same thing under far darker circumstances. I began to understand that the buried fortune wasn't simply money, it was the last chapter of events that had twisted our bloodline into silence. The closer I came to certainty, the more I felt my grandmother's warning beating like a second heart inside my chest. Conscience first, then action. I learned to stop when the ground felt near, like she said. I learned to listen to fear, not as an enemy, but as information. Even today, small, details ambush me. A handwritten recipe with odd spacing that marks distances. A crack in the cellar floor aligned perfectly with a star she drew once in the margin of a notebook. The truth is woven into the fabric of our family life like a secret language. I know the place. I could walk there in the dark, but knowing has never been the same as touching, and the cost of turning that knowledge into reality has been the silent companion of my entire adulthood, shaping every decision I've made, without ever needing to speak its name. People assume the hardest part of a buried fortune is finding it. They're wrong. The hardest part is deciding what kind of person you become once you know exactly where it is. I grew up, built a life, raised children, paid bills, all while knowing that with one night, one shovel, I could change everything. That knowledge sounds like power, but it felt more like a loaded weapon left on my kitchen table. Every time I was broke, every time life cornered me, the map rose in my mind like a temptation and a warning at the same time. The first real test came when I was 32. I lost my job, our second child was on the way, and the refrigerator looked like a broken promise. I drove to the edge of the property at dusk and sat there with the engine off, listening to the insects. 10 more minutes and I would have started walking. Then I remembered my grandmother's face when she said, "Conscience first." It wasn't superstition stopping me. It was the realization that this money didn't just belong to us. It belonged to a past soaked in choices nobody wanted to admit out loud. Taking it would mean joining that chain instead of breaking it. Years later, a different twist arrived. A distant cousin I barely knew pulled me aside at a funeral and said too casually, "Some things are better left underground." He smiled like it was a joke, but his eyes stayed on mine as if he was measuring what I knew. That was when I understood something chilling. I was not the only one circling the secret. Others had searched. Some had gotten close, and some had backed away for reasons they didn't put into words. The silence in our family wasn't ignorance. It was agreement, born from fear and experience. And there was something else, heavier than fear, pattern. Everyone who reached for quick salvation in my family seemed to pay for it in slow ways. Marriages cracked, loyalties dissolved. People left town and never quite came back to themselves. The money had gravity, not mystical but human. It pulled people toward their worst impulses, greed, revenge, justification. I didn't want my children learning that the solution to hardship lived in the ground rather than in their hands, their work, their character. So I chose to live with less instead of live with that. I won't pretend I was noble, I was afraid. Afraid of becoming the kind of man my grandmother was asking me not to become. Afraid of what truths I would dig up along with the metal and paper. So I waited, and life kept unfolding. And the map stayed folded too. The question was never, could I? It was always, what would this turn me into? And that question has followed me right up to this age, as the secret keeps breathing underneath everything that came after, pushing me toward the part of the story I still need to tell. Some people knew pieces of the truth, and then they faded from our family like photographs left in the sun. An uncle who laughed too loudly at nothing moved. Away overnight. A cousin stopped using our last name and said new beginnings were healthier than answers. No one ever said the word fortune, but every whisper bent toward it, like iron toward a buried magnet. I learned to read absence the way others read letters. The first hint came when I was 19. I found a note tucked in a recipe book. "Do not go alone." It was my grandmother's handwriting, but the paper smelled of my grandfather's cologne, a ghost of intention. Weeks later, that book vanished, and so did the aunt who had borrowed it. She sent postcards from states that sounded temporary, always with the same line, "The land remembers." Then the cards stopped. We called. Phones rang into weather. Years later, another thread pulled loose. A man I didn't recognize waited by my car after church and said my name the way a locksmith says the last click. He told me my grandparents once kept a ledger that was never meant to be opened in daylight. He didn't ask me anything. He only said, "Some accounts are settled by silence," and smiled as if he had given me a blessing or a warning. I never saw him again, but I began to notice small convergences, locked drawers emptied, old friends becoming strangers at just the right time. The pattern grew unavoidable. People who asked too many questions developed sudden reasons to leave town. Those who claimed to know nothing avoided eye contact with the land itself, taking the long way around the hill as if the ground listened. Our family photos marked these disappearances by the widening spaces between bodies. The story edited itself. Here is the part I have never said aloud. A few of them found the place. I could tell by the way they carried a new, fragile quiet, like someone walking with a secret temperature under their skin. But none of them dug. Something stopped them at the edge between knowledge and action, the same unseen line that stopped me. It was not a curse, not a legend, but the simple recognition that the origin of that money could not be unearthed without unearthing ourselves. If you have ever watched a truth erase people without a word, the question that haunted me wasn't where the money was. I had known that for decades. The question was why it had to be buried at all. Real wealth doesn't usually go into the ground unless someone wants it hidden from history itself. The answer came to me slowly, like a picture developing in darkroom chemicals. It arrived through fragments, a war medal wrapped. In cloth at the back of a drawer, an unsigned letter dated 1947, a newspaper clipping about a fire that destroyed records and property of uncertain value. None of them made sense alone. Together, they pointed to a single, uncomfortable truth. My grandfather hadn't simply been a businessman, as the family legend insisted. He was a facilitator, someone who made problems disappear for men who needed their problems buried as deeply as their money. The 1940s had left shadows long enough for anyone to hide in. Profits made during wartime, deals signed when fear made people flexible, cash paid to make inconvenient facts vanish. The fortune in the ground wasn't savings, it was residue, the leftover weight of choices people refused to carry into daylight. That was why my grandmother never called it treasure. She called it consequence. One document, brittle with age, shook me the most. It listed names without addresses, amounts without explanations, and a final line written in my grandmother's precise hand, not ours to spend. I imagined my grandfather pacing at night, coins of guilt rattling in his mind louder than any wealth could quiet. He died younger than he should have, and for the first time I wondered if the weight of what he kept had crushed something inside him long before his heart finally stopped. The land did not guard gold, it guarded unfinished accountability. When I finally admitted to myself what that money represented, the temptation changed shape. It wasn't just the moral riddle of taking what wasn't earned, it was a question of inheritance. Do we inherit only what our ancestors intended for us, or also what they refused to face? The cash underground felt like a frozen moment in history, a decision postponed instead of resolved. If I dug it up, I would not just be taking money, I would be reopening every bargain that created it. And then there was the uncomfortable realization that some of that wealth might still be claimed by people who had no idea it existed, but whose lives had been altered by the acts that produced it. How do you own something built from silence and loss? You don't. You become its custodian or its accomplice. My grandmother chose custodian. She buried it and buried the story, hoping time would do the rest. Time didn't. It delivered the question into my hands instead. Knowing this didn't make the decision easier, it made it heavier. Every time I thought of the fortune, I didn't see opportunity. I saw faces. In yellowed photographs, factories that closed, signatures written under pressure, and families like mine trying to move forward without saying the words out loud. The origin of the money wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a mirror, and standing in front of it has taken me a lifetime. Now I am 77 and time has stopped being theoretical. Doctors circle dates on calendars. Friends' names move from my phone to headstones. The map has outlived almost everyone who created it, and it keeps looking at me from the drawer like an unanswered letter. There are days I hold it and feel like a boy again, trembling with the electricity of secret knowledge. Other days I feel like a gatekeeper who has stood watch too long and is unsure whether opening the gate or leaving it closed will do more damage. The fortune hasn't moved an inch. I am the one who has changed around it. The dilemma is not dramatic on the outside. It's quiet and relentless on the inside. One choice. I dig, and everything buried. Comes with it questions from authorities, claims from strangers, fractures in my family that will never mend. Another choice. I burn the map, erase the trail, pretend the past can be sealed by fire. The third, I reveal it without touching it, hand the burden to history. Let others decide what justice looks like. Each path has a cost that cannot be refunded, And age has taught me there are debts you don't see until they arrive at your door. Yesterday, I stood at the edge of the land again. The air had that stillness before rain, the kind that makes the world hold its breath. The ground felt familiar under my shoes, in a way only old companions do. I whispered my grandmother's sentence out loud for the first time in 60 years. You will know when the ground calls you. Did it call me then? Or was it just memory speaking in my own voice? A hawk circled overhead. The world went on normally, and yet I felt the past leaning close like a listener pressing an ear to a wall. What surprised me most wasn't fear. It was tenderness, for the boy I was, for the people who made mistakes they couldn't repair, for the future faces who might live differently if the truth were allowed into daylight. Secrets don't rot in the earth. They ferment. They change flavor over time, becoming either poison or medicine depending on how they are finally used. I used to believe the map was a direction to money. Now I think it might be a question about who we become when the truth costs something. Sooner or later, the decision will be made, by my hands or by someone else's when I am gone. Paper doesn't last forever, but stories do, and the land remembers more faithfully than we do. I'm standing at the thin place between past and consequence, feeling both sides breathe. I have not dug, not yet, but the weight of doing nothing grows heavier with each passing season, and silence is also a choice that shapes what comes next, just as surely as action would. If you stayed with me until the end of this, confession, thank you. Listening to a life laid bare is not easy. These aren't just stories about buried money or old secrets. They're about the choices that shape who we become and the truths we carry longer than we should. If anything in what I shared made you pause, remember someone, or question a silence in your own family, you are exactly who I was hoping would hear this. If you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next confession. There are more stories like this, stories that were never supposed to be told out loud, and I don't know how much time I have left to tell them. If you made it all the way here, leave a comment with the words, "The ground remembers." That way I'll know you were one of the few who stayed with me until the last line. And if this story meant something to you, leave a like. It helps this confession reach others who might be carrying their own buried history. Thank you for listening. And if another video is now appearing on your screen, don't ignore it. That story too was meant to find you.